food. Sauerkraut is one of the.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to Fermented and Fabulous Sauerkraut Edition today with Talia Orzek. She is going to be teaching us how to make a very basic fermented vegetable sauerkraut. So go ahead, Talia.
Perfect. Hi, I'm Talia. I'm a third-year clinical nutrition major here at Davis, and I love making sauerkraut and I love all fermented foods. I think they're super easy to make. And I've noticed how there's been such a surge in popularity with a lot of people drinking kombucha, drinking kefir, lots of yogurt and kimchi. And so I just want to show how easy it is to make one of these foods like sauerkraut at home, especially because when you're buying it, it is quite expensive sometimes. So, and also that buying expensive probiotics is often not necessary in the slightest, and the benefits are so much more from foods like sauerkraut. So I'm kind of just going to give you an overview of what you would need if you were to make sauerkraut. So you're going to need any sort of large bowl. I have one like this, and then measuring spoons, some things to pound your sauerkraut down, which I'll show later. I'm using 32-ounce ball jars. Kind of any jar would work, but I kind of have the most success from these. And I'm also using fermentation lids. I'll kind of go into a little bit how you would make this if you don't have fermentation lids. But if fermenting is something that you want to get into more, I would buy them because they make it so much easier and they just screw right on top of your ball jars. So that makes it very easy. Also, what's super nice about these lids that I have is that they come with a little recipe book too, if that's something that you're interested in. And then you're just gonna need kosher salt. This is the one that has, it's flaky, it's not super fine, and cabbage. So I'm using today a combination of both green cabbage and purple cabbage. I like using green because it has a lot more liquid in it, which I'll get into, but it's super important to make sure that your cabbage is fully submerged in your jars in order for to limit growth of pathogenic bacteria and also just to help with the fermentation. And then I'm also using purple cabbage because purple cabbage makes it a lot more beautiful. And I love the combination of both of them. Also, purple cabbage has anthocyanins, which is it's a plant pigment that has antioxidant benefits. So, and also we always love to talk about eating the rainbow, and having purple cabbage is a great way to incorporate more color into your diet, especially if you're eating it on the side. So just to start off, I'm going to start by cutting my cabbage. You kind of want to make it, I'll show as I'm making it, the kind of small pieces. Oh, and also I wash my hands. Make sure that you wash your hands first. So I'm just kind of chopping my cabbage. And you kind of can make it whatever size you want it to be. I don't know if this picks up very well on the camera, but these are kind of like around an inch or so. But any size works. It also is easier to make if you want in the food processor, but then your cabbage pieces would be a lot smaller, which I personally don't like. I like having like some of the texture of the cabbage in my sauerkraut. So then I'm just putting it in the bowl. And sauerkraut is actually one of the oldest fermented foods. Fermented foods have like gone back for a while and like most ancient civilizations because of preservation, especially before there was like refrigeration. And one of the first like recorded uses of sauerkraut was in ancient China, like around 2,000 years ago. And then it spread actually to like the Romans, and they would eat a lot of sauerkraut because people that ate sauerkraut got sick less, which is something that they noticed. it was quite common for like the Roman Empire. And so yeah, I'm just chopping this up and putting it in my bowl. Also, I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with Captain Cook, who circumnavigated the globe, and he brought barrels of sauerkraut with him because of the high vitamin C content, and it prevents scurvy, which is really cool. So yeah, it's been in for a very good time. Mm. Perfect. And now I'm just going to be chopping up my purple cabbage. Sorry, I'm not talking too much. I'm trying to focus on not cutting myself on accident. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Can you repeat how the purple cabbage is beneficial?
Oh yeah, so purple cabbage has a plant pigment called anthocyanin, which is has very strong antioxidant properties. And antioxidants have been shown in the diet to help prevent inflammation, and it can be beneficial for heart health. And it's really important in your daily diet to try to incorporate like a wide variety of fruits and vegetables with a huge range of colors in order to get like a diverse vitamin, mineral, like a diverse amount of vitamins and minerals, and also plant pigments. They're very beneficial. And then these are a little bit bigger, but it's totally fine. So I now have all of my cabbage cut up in my bowl, and it's quite full, as you can see. And so the next step is that we're gonna add our salt. And salt and cabbage are the two main ingredients that you use for sauerkraut. And it's super important that you have a good amount of salt, approximately like a 2% salt to cabbage ratio if you're using a scale. I'm not using a scale, in case you don't have a scale at home, that's totally fine. The amount of cabbage I have is probably about like a medium to large cabbage. So I'm going to use around 2 tablespoons of salt. But if you're using more cabbage, I would use more. It's just all about, yeah, around a 2% ratio.
Talia, and you said that we should be using salt without iodine, is that correct?
Oh, yes. It's really important to not use iodine salt. I'm using like kind of more thickly ground kosher salt. You can use finely ground salt or pink Himalayan salt or sea salt, but as long as it doesn't have iodine, because that can kind of interfere with the taste and also with the fermentation process. So it's important that you don't use those. So now what you're gonna do, I washed my hands, is you're just gonna really get in here with the salt and massage it into your cabbage. Um, I've heard some people say they don't wash their hands. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would wash your hands, but just to incorporate the bacteria that you're gonna use. So it's super important to just massage it in there. And I'm not just mixing it, like I'm actively like pressing it into my cabbage, because what we're trying to do is the salt breaks down the cabbage and creates that liquid that we really want. And so the more that you really press it, is the more liquid will be produced. And then once I'm done massaging it, we're gonna let it sit for around like 10 minutes approximately. Yeah, make sure you're really massaging your cabbage. And what you'll notice pretty quickly is that liquid already is starting to come out of the cabbage, and it's becoming a lot softer almost immediately. So I'm gonna kind of mix this in for around a minute or so. This is a bit of a messy process, so I would do this somewhere that you're fine with getting everywhere.
So Talia, we can use any amount of purple and green cabbage we want
Yes, you just want to make sure that you have the right ratio of around 2% weight of salt,
for salt.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
but you can use any.
Could I put other vegetables in there?
You could, definitely. I've heard some people do finely sliced cucumber or some other things like that. But I would recommend when you're starting out just doing cabbage or doing a vegetable that has a high liquid content in it, because what we're really trying to do is create like a lot of liquid to come out, and you're gonna see that when I start packing it into the jars. But
I can see it already.
you can see it already, yeah. But if you're using vegetables like carrots, those don't have very much liquid in them. So those might not be the best option. And so now that I have this in here, we're gonna wait for around 10 minutes to let all of the liquid start to come out of the cabbage and the cabbage to start breaking down. And I have a little bit of information about probiotics. So one of the main sauerkraut has probiotics that are formed by the lactic acid bacteria and lactic acid fermentation, which is an anaerobic process. So there's no air, which is why we want that layer of liquid. And using a tap like this is super awesome because it makes it so the carbon dioxide can leave, but no oxygen is going to be getting into your sauerkraut. Because if you're making it with a regular lid, it can, if you're opening it a lot, that can lead to things like mold and yeast growing, which affect the taste. And if there's mold, you have to throw it away. But probiotics are microorganisms that are in your gut microbiome, and probiotics are kind of an emerging area of research, but some research right now is showing that they have an effect on immunity and play a role in preventing intestinal diseases. And I was kind of looking into some research around this, and I came across one study that I thought was really interesting. And it was a study with twins. So they had one twin that was obese and one twin that was lean. And they also had some pairs of twins that were both the same. And they were looking at their gut microbiomes. And what they found is that in the twins that were obese, there was a change in their gut microbiota. And they actually, the processes where they were breaking down, especially like carbohydrates and getting the energy from those, they were working, like they were a lot more efficient at that for the twin that was obese. And they took that, the gut microbiota, and they put them in mice, and then they fed the mice the same diet. And what they found is that the mice with the microbiota of the obese twin actually gained fat and gained weight significantly faster than the other mice that were just given the microbiota from the leaner individual, even though they were being fed the exact same diet and they were actually twins. So I thought that was really interesting because it shows how adaptable our microbiomes are, and that they're not just taking a back seat in our health. They're like a very active participant and component. And I thought that was very interesting. And yeah, so in general, probiotics kind of play a role in homeostasis. And kind of one mechanism of that is potentially that they compete with pathogenic bacteria, but there's some other proposed mechanisms as well. But yeah, it's a very interesting area of research and how probiotics could potentially have an impact on all of those things and how our health is so yeah, our health. What's it called?
Depends
It's
on
not
those
one
little
dimensional.
bugs.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Definitely.
I'm always worried I'm gonna get the bad bugs in mine if I try it.
Yeah, so that's I think it's kind of scary because I know, at least for me, I'm very concerned about food safety and not leaving foods out on the counter. And so I know that for some people, fermentation is definitely it's like an area that's maybe out of your comfort zone because you have to leave it out and you're trying to grow bacteria. But these are the good bacteria, these are lactic acid bacteria that's beneficial for you. And as long as you're careful about making sure, I'll show when I start packing it down, but that you're really packing it down and that there's not any air, it should be okay with making sure that no pathogens grow. But having that salt ratio is really important.
So that anaerobic environment is critical.
It is really
That makes
critical,
sense.
yeah. I'm gonna leave this for a couple more minutes. I got some questions. Would this be a good time to
Yep.
answer questions? Yeah. So I got a couple of questions which I can start going into when people registered. And the first one was homemade sauerkraut has been one of my more successful at-home fermentations. All others have struggled with yeast and resulted with a more yeasty flavor. Are there good suggestions for controlling the yeast growth? And yes, I do. So surface yeast kind of tend to grow when there's oxygen. And so making sure that you're really packing down the sauerkraut and that there's no oxygen is really important for preventing the growth of yeast. Also, I know it's hard in the summer in Davis because it's really hot. And I know at least for my apartment, it gets really hot and our AC doesn't work very well. But trying to keep it at like a cooler temperature, kind of around like 68 to 70 degrees is a little bit better to prevent yeast growth. And then also, one thing you can do is you can take a larger cabbage leaf and I don't know if you're using a weight or just weighing it down with a cabbage leaf, but putting a cabbage leaf on top of your cut cabbage before you put the weight on top can be important in case there is any yeast growth. It's not actually in the cabbage that you're eating. It's just at the top. Like that is one suggestion that I have. As for other types of like fermentations, I'm not sure. I haven't really explored much. I have made kombucha, but not in a while. So I can't answer questions on that. But that's kind of the only area of fermentation that like I personally have experience with. Another question I got was, are there any downsides health-wise to eating sauerkraut regularly? And I would say this kind of goes into another topic too. I would say the main downside would be the high sodium content, especially if blood pressure, like elevated blood pressure, is an issue that you're experiencing. But also as for the cabbage does have a good amount of fiber in it, which I think is like one of the main benefits for it because it has prebiotic fiber, which is super necessary for the probiotics. So it's kind of like a package deal in that way. But I think like eating a high amount of fiber for anybody, regardless of if it's like whole grain bread, whole grains, vegetables, can cause stomach discomfort if that's not something that you're used to. So if you're not used to eating a lot of fiber-rich foods, maybe incorporate sauerkraut slowly. And that would be the same with sodium. It's not necessarily the type of food where you need to start eating a cup of it a day or a cup of it one time to see benefits. It's kind of more of the food where you should eat not just sauerkraut, but any fermented food, like a small portion every single day, almost like a probiotic supplement. And that's kind of where you see the health benefits is from use over time, like intake over time, and not just like a one time eating it a singular time. Yeah. And then kind of to go a little bit more into the sodium, because a couple people asked about that too. It is something to be aware of if you have high blood pressure, because as you can see, I did put like 2 tablespoons of salt in here. Of course, like you're not going to eat it all at once, but it's not a low sodium food. I know there are low sodium sauerkrauts on the market. I have not made it. I would not recommend making it yourself just because from like a food, like getting the proper amount of liquid and all that is super necessary with using salt. I know you could potentially substitute it with something else like sugar, but I'm not really, that's not like an area that I've looked into. So I would potentially buy that. You also could potentially rinse your sauerkraut before eating it, but that would get rid of some of the probiotics also alongside the sodium.
You know, one
Or
thing I realized, Talia, is that cabbage has an awful lot of potassium. And
Yeah.
For the potassium sodium ratio, I don't know if you were gonna talk about that, but
yes,
that's part of the blood pressure problem with sodium is when we eat too much of it in the absence of potassium.
Right. Exactly. So cabbage does have potassium, but it doesn't have that much. I would say eating other potassium rich foods, if you were going to eat sauerkraut, so like sweet potatoes, spinach, those foods are very high in potassium. I think that that would be a good thing to pair with sauerkraut if you were worried about the high sodium content, for sure. I don't know. So I don't know if you can tell, it's already in the bowl. The cabbage is already starting to really wilt and break down. I think I'm gonna give it a couple of more minutes. And then I have not made, is it pronounced natto?
Natto?
Natto? Yeah, I have no experience making natto, but that does seem like something that I would love to try making in the future. I do have some experience making kombucha. And I got another question about candida and fermented foods. I think that that's something that you should go over with a medical professional or a dietitian because, and I was looking at the research, there was very like conflicting sources about that. I think sauerkraut's a little bit different though from other fermented foods like yogurt or what's the other one? Kombucha, apple cider vinegar, because those were all yeast based. Um, Sauerkraut's lactic acid, like the bacteria, lactic acid bacteria. So it could potentially be different. I heard some sources say that it could be good after it's the overgrowth has resolved, but that's something to definitely like look into a little bit more with a medical professional. And sauerkraut, once you've made it, um, can last in the fridge for at least 6 months or even longer. Like it's kind of like almost similar to like a pickled vegetable where it stores under in the fridge for a while. So I think this is almost, I think I can start packing
Maybe
this in
before you
soon.
Do that, you could, we got a question
Oh,
about the
perfect.
brand of fermentation lids that you purchased.
Oh,
and
yes.
Get those.
So these are, they're called the Easy Fermenter. Yeah, they're my mom got these. I did not get them because she makes sauerkraut all the time. But I think they're from Amazon. You could probably buy them at Amazon. I assume also like any health food store might have them. Same with I'm gonna use fermentation weights. These are also from Amazon, I believe. Okay, so I think I'm gonna start packing this down. So in order to make sure that there's no oxygen, it's really important to go kind of slowly with this. So you're gonna, so I also, at this point, your cabbage should be pretty soft. The green cabbage is definitely softer than the purple cabbage, which is something that I've noticed, which is that I like to do a combination of both of them. But you could totally do it with just purple cabbage also. Oh, and if you were going to add any other like spices, like I know some people add cumin seeds or ginger, this would be a good time to add them now. But if you're making it for the first time, I would wait and just do with cabbage first and see how successful that is and then kind of go from there. But I like adding ginger. And then you're kind of gonna fill it. And I think slow, it's best to go slow and add little bits at a time. So kind of around here. And then I have this to pack it down. You don't need to have a tool like this. I also, as an example, have another wooden spoon. You could use your hand, you could use a wooden spoon, you could use a regular spoon, any sort of thing to like pack down your cabbage. So I'll do it right now. So you're really just trying to squish it into the bottom of your jar. And what you'll see when you're doing this is that liquid is starting to bubble up as you're pressing it down. So you're really trying to break it down even further. And so I've smushed it kind of into a line. And then I'm just gonna keep repeating this process until the jar is full. Oh, and also I would make sure your jars are washed. I didn't do any specific sterilization for them. I just washed them in the dishwasher. I think that should be fine. Um, this is all like for you and your family or friends consumption. This is not like necessarily like I think there would be different food safety practices if you were going to make this for anybody else like outside of your household, like potentially fully sterilizing your jars and that type of thing. But I've been okay so far. And so I'm just gonna keep pressing it down.
And is it true, Talia, that the bacteria are perhaps more active in this sauerkraut that we would make at home than what you might buy in the store
Yes.
with the pasteurization and all of products before they're sold?
Yeah. So sauerkraut, I don't know if you were to buy it in a store, I'm not quite sure if they pasteurize it or not. But I know that
You
like
can get it either way.
yeah, when you pasteurization definitely kills a lot of the probiotics. So making like for example with yogurt, yogurt is technically like a probiotic food, but when you're buying yogurt at the store, there's very few probiotics left by the time it actually gets to you, unless you're buying specifically like probiotic yogurt. Yogurt's actually a food that you can totally make really easily yourself. I've never made it, but it's heard it's very, very easy. And
There's
then
a lot of liquid in there.
yeah, so I don't know if you can see on camera, but as I push this down, I'm putting a good amount of like weight on it. A lot of liquid is bubbling up. And it's purple from the purple cabbage, so it looks really pretty. I don't know if that's visible, but it's bubbling around. And this is super important because we're trying to limit
You
the
want
air
all of the cabbage under the liquid.
under the liquid, yeah. And that's where weighing it in is gonna come in later too. And that's why this tool's really handy. Like it makes it a lot easier to pack down. But I have done it with a wooden spoon as well. And this is also why letting it sit is really important too, because it helps create a lot more of the liquid. And then after everything is packed down, you're gonna put a weight on top. So if you have like a food grade weight, that would be amazing. I have these little glass weights. I heard they also have weight stones, or I even heard you can use another jar filled with water, or a large cabbage leaf to kind of weigh it down. But just ensuring that no cabbage is exposed to air is really important.
Does it matter how full we fill that?
I try to fill them to the top. You don't have to, I don't think, but you should try to fill it to the top, but just limiting air as much as possible. Yeah. So as you can, I don't know if you can see, but the liquid is really bubbling up now, almost to the very top. And it's a bit of a messy process. I would do it on a surface like this. And now that this is like all the way packed to the top now and really pressed down, there's quite a large layer of liquid here at the top. And so now what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your weight and you're gonna put your weight in your jar. This is very full. Press it down a little bit more. So now this liquid is covering the weight and it's all the cabbage is submerged. And then you're gonna take your fermentation lid or your regular lid and just screw it on top.
What size jar is that again?
This is a 32 ounce ball jar, yeah. You could use, I like the wide mouth makes it a lot easier, but you could use like a bigger one or a smaller one. I feel like the size is very handy. And then yeah, so now it's done. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna put it on, I like to put it on a towel just in case, because at the beginning a lot of like bubbles are formed and it can bubble over and leak a little bit. So putting it on a towel is good. And then also in a place where it's not like in a dark area of your house. So like a cupboard or a closet that's kind of at a neutral temperature. And you just let it be for at least a week. The longer you leave it, the stronger the flavor becomes. I kind of like around a week to 2 weeks, it gets pretty strong. I think if you're starting out, I would start with like 5 to 7 days and see if you like it from that. and kind of go from there. But I think up to 2 weeks is totally fine. But because it's Davis and it is hot, the process is going to be a little bit faster. So that is something to be aware of if your house is not like super air conditioned like mine is. And then I have a little more, so I'm gonna pack this in the other jar, but because this is not enough to like I kind of would want a smaller jar for this, so I'm just gonna save this. I'm not gonna ferment this amount because there's not enough of it. I think I have a couple more questions I can answer too.
Someone asked if we should wash or rinse the cabbage before use. And I assume that just like anything else, you would take off the outer leaves and rinse it off good.
Yeah, I would make sure you get anything that's brown or broken. I would take that off. And yeah, I would also make sure that you rinse it pretty well. And yeah, so for this one, I'm not gonna pack it, just I don't have enough to really fill this jar. And so I'm just gonna leave it. You probably could pack it down and put a lid on it, but I think if you had like, because this would only be the tiny amount on the bottom, for this small of an amount, I would just use a smaller jar. And yeah, that's pretty much the process. It's very easy.
So then you said that after a week or 2 weeks, that it should be fermented. And when we want it to stop fermenting is when we put it in the fridge?
Yeah. So you're gonna leave it for as long as you want it to ferment out in a cupboard with either your fermentation lid, or if you want to use the Baldor lid, I would just not secure it fully. Like kind of just like leave it so some air can get out. If you don't do that, you could open it, crack it to let some of the air out because you don't want your jar to explode. But kind of just cracking it here and there but it's really important to not let oxygen get into your sauerkraut.
So the fermentation lid lets gas out, but not oxygen.
Yeah, exactly.
So if it's bubbling up, that's a good thing.
Yeah, the bubble should resolve in a couple of days though.
Okay.
It's
So
just for the
that's not
first stage. No, it's just for the first stage. With this, like there's no air in here and
Yeah,
it is
I can see that.
unsecure. Like if your jar is like this full with fully submerged in liquid, you really don't have to worry. If it is something you're worried about, you could get pH testing strips. That can be and then if you test the pH of your sauerkraut and it's acidic, that's a really good sign because botulism can happen if it's not acidic enough. So testing the pH is a good way to go if you want to be sure. But what's cool too about the purple bacteria is that as it gets more acidic and as it ferments, the color is going to change from this dark purple to more of like a bright pink, purple, magenta. And that color change is a really good way to tell if it's done. And then if you were doing green cabbage, it kind of turns green to more of like a bright yellow brown, which isn't quite as pretty, but like there is a very noticeable color change when it's done fermenting.
Amazing how pretty that looks because you only had like a half a head of red cabbage.
No,
and a whole head of
yeah,
green.
no, the 50-50 ratio is a really good ratio to make really pretty sauerkraut. Oh, I also got a question about the difference between fermenting and pickling. Pickling has no probiotics. So like when you're pickling something, you're using a vinegar normally and a high amount of salt, and that process does not have any fermentation. You're just also pickling is normally a quicker process, and the acidity of sauerkraut and other fermented foods comes from the bacteria over time. So it gets more acidic the longer you leave it, which is why some people like eating their sauerkraut faster versus leaving it out for longer. And then also a lot of pickles are pasteurized. So that'll have no probiotics. So yeah, so the health benefits only are coming from your fermented foods and not pickled foods. And also I got a question about cooking the sauerkraut and then flavor and people that don't necessarily like the taste of fermented foods. So I would not recommend cooking with sauerkraut because that heat is going to kill the probiotics. But it's really good. You can eat it with tons of foods. You can put it on a salad, in a wrap, what are other ways, like on a hot dog, or there's like sandwiches as a condiment. Yeah. And that's also why it's beneficial for like for people who are trying to lose weight, is that it doesn't have a lot of calories in it and it's very flavorful. So it's a very easy, like it's perfect as a condiment. And for people that also might not like probiotics, sorry, not probiotics, fermented foods, sauerkraut's pretty neutral, I feel like, but also if you like yogurt, you could try to make your own yogurt because that has a much higher probiotic content, has a much higher probiotic content than yogurt you buy at the store. And it's a lot more affordable also.
So when we're using the fermentation lid, would you say that there's not much of a risk of the jar shattering if it explodes?
No, because it has this valve at the top which will let
Ah.
out any CO2.
So then it would be important to loosen the cap if you were using.
Yeah. So it doesn't explode, yeah.
And if you are weighting down the cabbage with a cabbage leaf
Mhm.
instead of a weight, right? Would you throw that away and you?
Yeah, you would not eat the cabbage leaf. Yeah, and you'd want to make sure, like, just like with the weight that the liquid is going above the cabbage leaf. Yeah. And then one of the last questions I got was about weight loss and fermented foods, and if fermented foods help with weight loss. And they on their own do not. But a healthy gut microbiome is really important for health as a whole, whether that be weight loss or just overall health. I think it's super important. Eating a wide variety of foods is just super important to overall health. And so, because fermented foods can help reduce low grade inflammation, which is important for everybody. So, yeah, and it's not like a one-time solution. It would be eating fermented foods daily.
So on a very regular basis.
And I think those were all the questions that I got from
Yeah.
before.
Awesome.
I'm not sure if there's any
Let's
other
see if we
ones.
have any other on the Zoom call.
I
So
hope.
that's gonna be ready in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I'm gonna probably let this one go for like a week and a half. And I hope that was all clear. If there's any other questions too about the process, please.
So someone
You
asked
know.
if there are any other fermented foods that are fairly easy to make.
Mm-hmm.
So you could really use any vegetables, and do the same process.
Well, what's super cool about these lids too is that there's a recipe book with a lot of different fermented vegetable recipes in there. You probably could with other vegetables. I have not tried, so I cannot speak to that fully, but I'm sure there's a wide variety. Also, kimchi is a bit more of a tricky process because there's a lot of other flavors that go into it, but I assume the actual like fermentation process of kimchi would be similar to sauerkraut. And I heard yogurt's rather easy to make. Kombucha is a little bit more difficult because you have this yeast organism called a SCOBY, which is a little scary looking. And that process is a little bit more complicated, but you can totally do it too.
Thank you so much for the information, Talia.
Yeah.
It makes me want to go try to make some sauerkraut
You should.
after I get some fermentation.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing with us today. Thank you everyone for coming. Do we have any last questions? No, we will write the recipe out and we will send the recipe out along with the recording after we get the recording through Zoom. So we'll send that out to everyone who registered for the webinar. And thank you again, Talia, today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I hope, yeah.
Take care, everyone.